All right. So, we're back. And we're continuing with Harold Weisberg's Kerry Thornley files. So it appears as though Kerry Thornley went on some kind of, I'll call it the guilty conscience media tour between January and February of 1968. So on the last episode, we went over an interview that Kerry Thornley did in January of 1968 from Tampa, Florida, right? And the following month, looks like just a couple weeks later, on February 5th, 1968, looks like he did another one of these things in St. Petersburg, Florida. A show called Open Mic with Bob Rourke, Ruark. St. Petersburg, Florida, February 5th, 1968, WLCY Radio. Our guest is Kerry Thornley, who has testified during the Warren Commission investigation of the Kennedy assassination. He testified and is in the records. He has now been subpoenaed to New Orleans for the grand jury investigation being conducted by District Attorney Jim Garrison. If you start dialing now, you will be one of the first on to question our guest. The numbers to call in Tampa, 229-7976, in St. Petersburg, 525-2131. Kerry, I want to thank you for getting here. Actually, a little trouble. We were going to schedule you about 10 o'clock, but you were a little late getting here. I didn't show up on time, right? Well, that's all right. Sometimes you have a little trouble finding the place, and I'm not going to tell anybody where we are because we hide. Sure do, Kerry agreed. Actually, you called me about correcting some of the items which you felt were mistakes by Mr. Weisberg when he was a guest earlier in this month. Was it, let me see. No, it was last month, the 22nd of last month. Do you recall the particular points? Now I can get the tape out and play those particular portions which pertain to it, but I imagine that you may recall those points. I recall them quite well. I stayed up the night after I heard them, going over them in my mind because I was quite irritated. I didn't intentionally stay up. I stayed awake all night thinking about them. First of all, the context in which these statements are made, I'd like to remind anyone or inform anyone who isn't aware that the 9th of last month, District Attorney Garrison made the statement that I had failed to tell the whole truth to the Warren Commission, and then went on to make some accusations, which I have maintained all along and continue to maintain were totally false, about me being associated with Oswald in New Orleans. But Mr. Garrison is apparently going up the basis of witnesses, so I can't blame him for making these statements. Perhaps he has reason to believe that they are true. However, Mr. Weisberg came on the air on the 22nd of last month and made some statements about me, which I know he knew better than to consider them true, because in each case they were half-truths, and I feel that Mr. Weisberg didn't tell the whole truth, and I'd like to provide some of the enlightening details regarding these statements. To begin with, a minor thing, he mentioned that Oswald was not a book but a pamphlet. To Mr. Rourke, is that a book or a pamphlet as far as the format goes? What, is this by you? Is this what, that's right, that's a paperback, which, well, all right, in the context of a book, this is a book. Now, in the context of the size of his works, you might consider it a pamphlet by size, but it is a paperback book. Yeah, well, the only reason I object to this is because I felt it gave the impression that Oswald was something that I ran off in my cellar, that I was passing out on Canal Street. Let me, by the way, give the people an opportunity, too, since we are identifying this. It's printed by New Classic House. It's called Oswald by Kerry Thornley, and it's 7N777 Allied is the number. And again, New Classic House is the printer. Let me see if there's an address in case people wish to. They're in Chicago, Illinois, and I think they are listed in the phone book under Novel Books Incorporated. Right, a division of Novel Books, Inc., 2715 North Pulaski Road, Chicago. And it has just a plain cover on it, nothing on the cover except one little circle and arrow, which is an out-of-context quote. Rourke then asks, "In your own book, huh?" "Just on the cover." Rourke asks, it says, I have never personally known an individual more motivated by a genuine concern for the human race than Lee Harvey Oswald. It's the cover of your book, and it's a misquote, huh? It was. Quote, I have never personally known an individual motivated by what appeared to be a more genuine concern for the human race, end quote. And the publisher wanted to sell books, so he shortened it. However, inside the book, anything under my byline, I'll say that for him, he didn't change a word. That's all just as I said it. I don't continue to agree with all the things that I said. One of them was the assumption that Oswald was the lone assassin, which I made at that time on the basis of the Warren report. All right, Mr. Weisberg said that it wasn't for me to decide whether I was a material witness in New Orleans and that I was uninformed on the matter because the reason I was being called was because I had testified to the Warren Commission that Oswald had a, quote, secret clearance. Well, I did not testify that Oswald had a, quote, secret clearance. I testified that there was a rumor to that effect that I had heard once, and that I couldn't remember at that time where I had heard it, and I still can't remember where I heard it. Then Mr. Weisberg went on to say that not only did Oswald have a secret clearance, but he had a, quote, top secret crypto clearance, which is, I understand, the highest that you can get, and he didn't say this as one who was guessing. He said it as one who knows. So I assume he has proof for it all. Well, in this case, if Mr. Weisberg can prove that Oswald had a top secret crypto clearance, I don't see why Mr. Garrison needs me to stand up in front of the grand jury in New Orleans and say that I once heard a rumor that Oswald had a, quote, secret clearance. Now, I'm not challenging that he can prove it. I think it's very possible that Oswald maybe did have a, quote, top secret crypto clearance. Rourke, let me interrupt here because, again, you did hear the show. Yes. I was under the impression now that you bring that up that he was making reference to and using as a source on the commanding officer of Oswald. He said he testified that this happened. Kerry then asks, did he say this? If he said this, I don't certainly recall it. This is what popped into my mind, and I'm not sure either until I play back that tape, but I had the impression, but go ahead. Kerry says, well, the fact is that even tracking down the rumor would be difficult unless I can remember who told it to me. And I wasn't in the habit of writing down the source of every bit of scuttlebutt I heard in the service. And I've been thinking about it ever since, well, a couple of years now, and I still don't remember. And also, I have reason to doubt Mr. Weisberg's correctness of his information because the certificate of court which I received from Louisiana upon the basis of which my summons was issued had nothing about that subject in it. They said they wanted to call me down there to question me on my associations with Oswald in New Orleans in 1963, which it said in the certificate of court I had not been questioned about, which was also a false statement because I had been asked if I had seen Oswald in New Orleans in 63, and I had told the Warren Commission definitely not. All right, then the next point was then that a gentleman called up and mentioned that I hadn't had counsel at my hearing. Well, the reason I didn't have counsel was because I waived it because I had decided earlier that day not to fight extradition, and I called Mr. Garrison's office and I told him that I had decided not to fight extradition and that I was willing to cooperate with them fully because I had got to a point where I had decided that I would be better taking a chance on Garrison's honesty and going to New Orleans and clearing myself with him than fighting the matter. Damn, what a run-on sentence that was. And then Mr. Weisberg came up on the air and said, well, it was my own fault for not having an attorney at my hearing, giving thereby the impression that I had fought extradition and lost, and I wished to clear up that point. Either the information that I assume that Mr. Weisberg was calling from New Orleans, and, if so, he hadn't been by the district attorney's office that day. Rourke, I can clear up that particular point for you, Kerry, due to the fact that I was making the call. He was in Frederick, Maryland at the time. Kerry, oh? Rourke, and I read prior to that question, I read the news release that was given by the local press here as to, quote, the judge declared this or that and that, so based upon only the information he had is that you went to trial. Okay. And that you defended yourself. I think it was probably just a normal assumption. You could have had an attorney if you wanted it. Yes. But he wasn't even aware of it until we went on that night. He wasn't even aware that you appeared in court. Okay, then I'm not unhappy about that. And then finally, there is the point about not being very public-spirited. I have a very kooky political philosophy which gets me into a lot of trouble, and because I can't be classified as a right-winger or a left-winger, but I look at a left-winger to the right-wingers, and I look like a right-winger to the left-wingers, and a middle-of-the-road people, and I don't know what to make of me, but they think I'm some kind of extremist, and I guess I am. Because one thing I very much oppose to all this sorts of violence, including legalized, law and ordered, socially acceptable violence such as forcing, any such violence that involves initiating force against a man who has not committed any sort of crime against property or person. So therefore, I object to the power of subpoena. I object to the draft, and I object to putting propel into slave labor people into slave labor camps. And I say that the only difference between these three things is a matter of degree. A man could be subpoenaed for maybe 2 days, can be drafted for a couple of years, but put into a concentration camp for a couple of decades. But once the principle of a man's inalienable rights to his liberty is violated, it's up to the politician and the bureaucrat and the judge from then on to decide who gets how much liberty when. And I think that's a dangerous habit to get into, and I don't wish to convert others to my belief particularly, but I do not wish to participate in process, at least voluntarily, where I cause other people to be subpoenaed, people who are innocent, who are just being subpoenaed as witnesses. And the first time I cooperated just a little bit with Mr. Garrison back in September when I made out, swore out a signed statement for him clearing up some points in my Warren Commission testimony, he used that information to call a guy in and question him against his will, and that was why I didn't wish to cooperate with Mr. Garrison. And I believe that is public-spirited, because this man was a member of the public, and I believe being public-spirited is refraining from harming people who are members of the public, refraining from interfering with their private lives. And that's really all I have to say. Thank you very much, Bob. Actually, Kerry, you wouldn't mind answering any questions. Not at all. Of the people regarding this, so the people can call in, as you say your philosophy is unusual, only to the point, though I say unusual, where you mention subpoena. Now, of course, there's conflict and controversy on drafts, so that's not unusual. We have this back and forth. But in that of subpoena, this strikes me odd due to the fact that since obviously the right by a court to bring forth witnesses is to determine whether or not you are depriving a man of his life and liberty. Yes, well, of course, the purpose of the draft is to defend liberty. I mean, we all have these justifications, but the thing is, it's not up to one man to decide how another man is to act on behalf of liberty and freedom. That's my feeling. Rourke, well, I can understand your feeling, but let's say that I think personally that you're going a little far on the subpoena, but this is, of course, your feelings. This is your right to have a feeling like that. But in order for a person to have his rights protected, it would only be necessary for those with information which can either clear him or indict him available to the court. Thornley says, I believe there are other ways of handling this. You're speaking of deposition thing. Well, not only that, it would probably take a good half an hour or so to get into that, but I believe that basically, Eve, so long as man, if we believe in this country, a man is innocent until he is proven guilty. We should act as if we believe that, and we shouldn't throw people in jail while they're awaiting trial. And we should, I believe, and this is something that I just think would be ideal. It's not something I'm trying to go around converting people to because I don't believe it's worth my time to do so, because I don't think I could make that many converts to make any changes. But I believe the way to try a man would be say, okay, your trial is set for such and such a date. If you want to appear and not be tried in absence, show up. But even that. Rourke, well, let's face it, this is what a man does happen in effect, except for the degree of the case. You certainly wouldn't want someone apprehended in the act of murdering someone to voluntarily come to court at a certain date, so we're speaking of degrees now. Kerry, there are matter of degrees here, and I unfortunately can't claim to be a man of principle because I recognize matter of degree. And I believe that. I don't really go so far as to object to the power of subpoena when it's used. What I regard, of course, this is always a matter of individual choice. When I think it's being used discreetly, I don't raise a fuss about it, but I also felt that Garrison was using it indiscreetly simply on the basis of what I knew with my personal experience. Because the only crime this man committed, or the only thing that became a suspect, and he was subpoenaed as a witness because he was under suspicion, and the only information I provided was that this man spoke Russian with Oswald in the ranks at morning musters in MACS 9 back when I was in that outfit. Talking about Heindel. And I felt that, and Mr. Garrison developed the very theory that this man was a CIA agent who had been recruiting Oswald at that time. Kerry, I wonder, before we take our first phone call, Could you give us a very fast thumbnail sketch, just so people will be aware, of when you first came in contact with Oswald? In other words, what are your periods of contact that you had with him, so this will be the basis to work off of? There was only one period of contact. I met him when I was in MACS 9, about 3 months before I went overseas. And he had just gotten back from overseas, and I went to the outfit that he had been in. Later, as we were sort of ships passing in the night, one of us was going in one direction, him going out of the Marines, and me coming about to go to Japan. We got acquainted in this particular outfit we were in. We were both interested in ideas, and we had a lot of time to sit around talking in that particular outfit because we were watchstanders, or scope dopes, as they're called in the Marines. And so we got acquainted well enough so that when he defected to the Soviet Union some months later, or attempted to defect, I decided to write a book about him, because a novel about his character based on him, because I felt then that I understood why he became disillusioned with the United States. And that's what I wanted to explain in the book. Now, you say defected. Kerry attempted to defect. He wanted to renounce his citizenship, apparently. Oh, in other words, he had already been discharged from the Marines. Right. He went over, walked into an American embassy, plopped down his passport. I read it. See, I was in his old outfit. Now, when this happened, I was over in MACS 1 in Japan, and I was seeing the types of things that he called American imperialism, which amounted to Marines beating up on taxicab drivers and pushing people around, just lording it over the Japanese people like conquering heroes, and later the people in the Philippines and the people so-called free China when we were down there, which I didn't find any freer than I imagine the People's Republic of China is. The People's Republic. Now, what year was this? Kerry, this was when, let's see, this was late 1959, just a few months after Oswald and I had known each other at El Toro, that I read about him I read about this in the papers, in the Stars and Stripes overseas, and that I had been planning to write a book on the Marine Corps, and that gave me my theme, I felt. I would describe how a high-charging young Marine gradually became totally disillusioned with the United States, so much that he wanted to join the enemy. You mentioned free China. Were you in Taipei? We were in Taiwan. We were in Pingtung. Then I was down there. Oswald had gone down there on the previous maneuver, and I don't know where he was stationed when he was down there. We were at a little Air Force base on the opposite side of the island of Taipei. That place, that country, is just a complete dictatorship. The people have to stand up in the movies and sing the national anthem while a picture of Chiang Kai-shek is projected on the screen. And at a time, I, too, just became just very bitter about what we were doing over there, supporting this character, what we were doing. And the thing was, American Marines could get away, literally, if they wanted to, could get away with murder in Formosa, because the Chinese government was so interested in keeping the goodwill of the American government, because it wanted to invade the mainland someday with U.S. Marines, that Chinese officers, Chinese colonels, and generals would salute Marine enlisted men, you know? And Marines could go out on liberty, and some of them did and would, like, take rickshaws or pedicabs and throw them over a bridge. Some man's whole means of making a living destroyed like that, just for no reason, just sheer sadism, you know? And they were allowed to get away with this by the Chinese government because it was so interested in having Americans' assistance in the future. All right, let's get to the phone lines. Good evening, open mic. Hello, yes. On the phone, we had Mr. Weisberg on open mic twice, right? Right. Now, during those two sessions, he criticized the Warren Commission. Now, Mr. Thornton, you have read his books, no doubt. Do you find any of his criticisms based on facts or on just hypothesis? I would say that many of Mr. Weisberg's criticisms, many of Mr. Mark Lane's criticisms, many of Maggie Field's criticisms, many of Josiah Thompson's criticisms, many of Mort Saul's criticisms, Mort Saul has made public, and many of the criticisms that Mr. Garrison has made public in his speeches, I think are based on fact. All right, thank you for calling. Good evening, open mic. Hi. Get this radio away from me. I believe Mr. Thornley was speaking of a Mr. fellow named Heindel that he named in his testimony to Garrison, and said Mr. Garrison later called him in for questioning. That is correct. Mr. Heindel is mentioned in several places in the Warren Commission testimony, so that you weren't the only one who mentioned his name. I had been under the understanding that the only other place it's mentioned, at least, of course, I may have been entirely incorrect here, because I was relying upon the opinion of one critic of the commission, that the only place it was mentioned was in Mr. Heindel's affidavit, where he mentions that he had used the nickname Heindel sometimes, which, of course, was the name under which Oswald ordered the rifle. All right, so, yeah, good stuff here, right? Good stuff. I never realized how openly in 68 of all times, after the investigation of Clayshaw started, but prior to the trial of Clayshaw, Kerry Thornley is just out there running his mouth. Some would say that he's tainting the jury pool. Right? He definitely shouldn't be running his goddamn mouth. And he's avoiding a subpoena in the process, right? Oh, this is just no good. From a legal perspective, no good. But he's doing this to taint his own testimony. I'm telling you. To taint his testimony, to poison the jury pool, to make any words that come out of his mouth completely meaningless in a court of law. I wonder who was coaching him through this at the time. All right, continuing. Phone. No, he's referred to in questioning some of the other witnesses. I was just checking it a little while ago to be sure I wasn't too certain of it either, so you don't have to feel guilty about it anymore. Kerry, well, good, thank you. I'm glad to hear that, because I'm going to be in Mr. Garrison's hands in a few days probably, and any assurance I can have that he's operating on the basis of more evidence than I sometimes think he is, I'm glad to hear. Phone, I have a great deal of respect for him because he has so much to lose. He does have a great deal to lose. But the one thing Mr. Garrison got at one time had a great deal of my respect in New Orleans when he tore into the judges down there. I thought that he was a very courageous act. And Rourke, when was this? Oh, this was just not too long after he was elected. I was down there at the time, and he carried that all the way to, they sued him for defamation, and he carried it all the way to the Supreme Court and finally won it. But I spent so much time defending Mr. Garrison back in those days, and I heard so many arguments against him that I finally capitulated to the other side. And I was, quite frankly, I first heard that he was undertaking this investigation. It just didn't sound right to me. I didn't see how a man who was as reckless as he was, and sometimes I felt there was as much dubious comment about him in the Quarter and elsewhere in New Orleans. I just didn't see why he'd be taking up a politically suicidal thing like this, and I didn't follow it because I was interested in particular. I'm sort of tired of hearing about Oswald and about the Kennedy assassination and the whole thing. And so I feel that perhaps I am, shall we say, somewhat misinformed upon or ill-informed upon what Mr. Garrison specifically has been doing over the past few months. And I've been trying to catch up. And I find that in some areas I come to admire him more, and in other areas I have less admiration for him. Phone, I think I have to admire his courage. Now, someone asked you a question about the critics basing their criticism on fact. There are a couple of us that have been very conscientiously checking on Mr. Weisberg and his references to the 26 volumes, and there are only a couple of places where we would have any fault to find. Of one of those, he didn't go as far as he could have. He could have gone much further with his criticism. In other places, it's a matter of interpretation. Rourke, since and Kerry, I'm take this liberty here. Sure. This lady, I believe, is the same one that called and quoted the commanding officer's testimony out of the 26 volumes. Would you happen to have that handy so I can refresh my memory, since I know that Weisberg made reference to his commanding officer? I wonder if you could. To this commanding officer. I wonder if you could, if you had it handy, could you read that particular portion of the testimony? Perhaps that... Was this Colonel Poindexter, by the way? Donovan. Yeah, because he was commanding officer when I knew Oswald. And now, did you hear the name she said? I asked if it was Poindexter, and I thought she said one of them. No, John Donovan. Oh, Donovan. He was not Oswald's commanding officer by any stretch of the imagination. He was a lieutenant in that outfit, and I guess he was a first lieutenant. Unless there was another Donovan who also happened to be Oswald's commanding officer at the time, that man definitely was a lieutenant in MACS 9. All right, so... Let me screenshot this one here. John Donovan. Good name to know. Good name to look into. We'll discuss him again in a future show. Rourke. All right. Do you happen to have that handy, that testimony? Phone. No, I don't have that volume. I do have what Donovan said. I have it someplace else. Okay, well, If you get a chance, I would appreciate it if you could look out that particular volume and see what title they gave him as to what his position. Kerry, I'll tell you what he probably was. He was probably officer in charge of Oswald's section in MACS 9, which was the operations section. Now, there's another thing I'd like to mention in connection with the 26 volumes. I don't think it's necessary to read Mr. Weisberg's books or Mr. Lane's books or any of these people's books to become a skeptic of the Warren Report. I think it's only necessary to skim through the 26 volumes, and I think it takes about a half an hour before you begin to see the discrepancies if you've paid any attention when you read the Warren Report. Phone, the most outstanding thing to me, and the thing I was so disappointed about, time after time, a witness will be shown a statement that he supposedly made to the FBI, and he'll say, I didn't say that. This even happened to the Secret Service men who said they made no statements at all, and yet there were statements credited to them. Kerry, well, there's something to think about here. Now, if there was a high-level cover-up of some kind, just because the Warren Report and 26 volumes contradict each other doesn't mean that one of them is the whole truth. And two men contradict each other, they can both be liars too. And both of these sets of information were issued by the government. The question is, why did they choose to issue two mutually contradicting sets of information? All right, so real quick, what Kerry Thornley is saying here is that the summary of the 26 volumes and the 26 volumes directly themselves are completely in contradiction, which they are. Which they are. So, Kerry Thornley, well, there's something to think about here. Now, if there was a high-level cover-up of some kind, just because the Warren Report and 26 volumes contradict each other doesn't mean that one of them is the whole truth and the two men contradict each other. They both can't be liars. This is a really, really excellent point being made here by Kerry Thornley. And both of these sets of information were issued by the government. The question is, why did they choose to issue two mutually contradicting sets of information? Well, I think they just didn't think anybody would notice. In other words, why did they leave it lying around where someone could pick it up? Perhaps, I don't know. I've sometimes get very paranoid about all this, and I think maybe the 26 volumes were designed to lead a second cover-up right after the first one fell apart. This is always a possibility. This is some interesting commentary by Mr. Thornley. Rourke, all right, thank you for calling. On Donovan's, all right, fine, thank you, good night, good evening, open mic. Good evening, Mr. Rourke. I would like to ask your guest, Mr. Thornley, about Jim Garrison. Incidentally, is he going to write a book on Jim Garrison? Kerry, laughing, I don't know. I've sort of loosely thrown the idea around. I hate to write a book on Jim Garrison because for this reason I feel that Jim Garrison has been treated extremely unfairly by the press. I have read his Playboy interview and his speeches too, and even though I don't agree with the man and I don't agree with his methods and I sometimes doubt his sincerity and his motives and everything else, the press treatment he has gotten even in that case has been unfair. And I would hate to add to that. But then again, if I felt that I really had something to contribute, I can only say that after I go to New Orleans, really, any book I write would be based on personal experience. Jim Garrison was on The Tonight Show a couple nights ago, and Johnny Carson played the devil's advocate, and Jim Garrison said there was no evidence to indicate Oswald participated in the assassination, but he did indicate that Ruby was implicated by several witnesses. Now, did you come to this conclusion? And also, I had this, Rourke. Well, let's leave it with that. Kerry, yeah, it's a pretty big question right there, and I'll tell you what, I haven't come to any real conclusions because, once again, I have not considered the whole thing that important. With my particular semi-anarchistic political views, I consider it more the normal course of events for the government to cover up things and to lie about them than for it to tell the truth about them, and I believe the government lied about the attack on Pearl Harbor. Do you see the misdirection that he's doing here? His poor attempts at verbal judo. There was a man who called up after Mr. Weisberg and spoke and went down this big list of things and that, well, if you wanted to, you could look into this and you could look into that. Well, almost every one of these things, I think there was a cover-up involved, including the Lincoln assassination. But the point is, I think governments always say whatever is politically most expedient, and I think in a democracy they have to lie more because they are dependent on the votes of the people to stay in office. So, if anything, dictatorships are, if more ruthless, more also what are more honest at times. So I haven't been able following it closely enough. One of the critics of the commission contacted me shortly after my book came out and showed me the 26 volumes because in my book I had assumed that Oswald was guilty. And I mentioned that it was an assumption in the book, that I did operate on that assumption in as far as even tried to figure out what was going through his head at the time he committed the assassination. And this critic of the commission showed his set of the 26 volumes, and gee whiz, after one evening, I was a critic of the commission and never was a very earnest one and never a very scholarly one. I have no theories as to Oswald's innocence or guilt. I believe that Jack Ruby was certainly one of the most mysterious. The questions around him are bigger and harder to answer, it seems, than around anyone else. These all kinds of inexplicable little contradictions and details in the testimony about him and so forth, but I really don't know. In answer to your question, sir. All right, thank you for calling. Good night, good evening, open mic, hello, are you there? Okay, we've got a little foul up on the lines, I guess, so if you want to get in, you can still make it if you start dialing now. 229-7976 in Tampa, 525-2131 in St. Petersburg, and address your questions to our guest, Kerry Thornley, who will soon be. When do you have to testify before the grand jury in New Orleans, Kerry? Well, provided I don't come up with a legal out, I'll have to be down there on the 8th or 9th, and that's of this month? Yeah, oops, we're talking about Thursday pretty soon, and Friday of this week, huh? Yeah, we're talking about February 1968. Yeah, now that will be in New Orleans, and you've already testified, of course, to a, where was it you were first questioned by the Warren Commission or was it Warren Commission investigating? I was living in Arlington, Virginia at that time, which Mr. Garrison has used as evidence to one of my friends that I'm also an agent for the CIA because I went to Arlington, Virginia after the assassination. He didn't also implicate me with George Lincoln Rockwell so far as I know. George Lincoln Rockwell being the head of the American Nazi Party, which was a front for the ADL at the time. I was working for the doorman near Arlington, Virginia at that time. I had gone there at the invitation of a friend of mine whom I had known since the 3rd grade, and I feel I'm on fairly safe ground there in demonstrating my innocence of having gone back to report to CIA headquarters. I was in Arlington working as a doorman, as I say, and they called me up. Mr. Jenner called me up and asked if I would be willing to testify. Of course, once again, this is like Garrison asking me to cooperate voluntarily. Oh, so that's another thing I forgot to mention. Mr. Weisberg made this gesture to a friend of mine that I could cooperate voluntarily. He forgot to mention that at his side at the time was this Barbara Reed who thinks she saw me with Oswald back in September, expressing incriminating statements and suspicions about me the whole time. He was trying to get my cooperation through Clint Bolton. But that's neither here nor there. Clint Bolton, very important name we've yet to get to. We will in the future. I was asked if I'd come down and testify, and I, of course, said I would since I knew I had no choice, and I got some papers to that effect a few days later ordering me to come and explaining my rights to me and so forth. And when I went across on a bus over into Washington, the testimony was taken in a VFW building, which is just kind of sort of a catty corner in the back of the Supreme Court there, up on the 2nd floor where the President's Commission had its offices. I did not testify before the assembled commission of Earl Warren and so on and so forth. Very few people did. I testified before Albert Jenner and an assistant, John Ely, I believe his name was, who left the room after about the first 10 minutes of testimony. There was just Jenner and I, a court reporter, in the room when I testified. I saw Alan Dulles when I was there, and I saw Lee J. Rankin passing in the halls and this sort of thing, but at the local VFW club? Yeah, well, it was the VFW-owned building. Oh, I see. And it was upstairs, and there was no notice downstairs that it was up there or anything. I don't know whether there were, if it was any cloak and dagger or anything. Maybe I'm divulging secret information. Rourke, how did they happen to contact you to begin with? How did they know you had been associated with him? Well, right after the assassination, a number of things happened. For one thing, I was no admirer of President Kennedy's, as I'm no admirer of President Johnson's, or back to President Lincoln or President Washington, or even Thomas Jefferson was the closest president I'd come to admiring. And I think I was somewhat of a hypocrite because when he got into offices, he undid most of the things, he undid most of the principle he stood for by, well, first of all, making the Louisiana Purchase, but this is as it may. I felt like people were acting like a bunch of British subjects to the king and had just been killed, and I said something to that effect. The king is dead, and somebody said, long live the king, and I said, well, that's your opinion. And this immediately caused somebody else to say I was behaving in poor taste. which was just provoked me and all further because I believe that dictatorship, if anything else, is just being forced to abide by some other man's idea of what good taste is. So I can make all kinds of excuses for myself. I was working 12 hours a day at the time, and I was having a deteriorating relationship with a young woman and so forth. So I just kept needling all these people about the Kennedy assassination, asking them if they had been crying like that when the people in Katanga were all butchered with U.S. support and so on and so forth. And then that afternoon, somebody walks into the restaurant where I am working and says, well, they caught the guy who did it. And I said, oh, what was his name? And he says, I don't remember, but he was an ex-Marine who had been to Russia. And I said, oh, Oswald, I know him. And I think somebody called the FBI shortly after. Actually, I understand I was told by Mr. Jenner that an artist from Pirates Alley named Tony Shimbrowski had called the Secret Service with the FBI, and they came to interview me, within Saturday midnight. And the FBI came to see me a little later that week. Then I went to see the FBI when Oswald was shot volunteering my hope, because I really began to realize that human beings were being killed when I saw a picture of Oswald on the front page, because I had known him and it looked just like he had looked back in MACS 9. And he was, with that terribly surprised expression on his face and that slug going right into his gut. And that really was the first time it really got through to me that people were, that human beings were actually a human being had been killed, And at this time, everybody was going around acting very cheerful and glib about it. And the same people that had been so shocked about my callousness about the Kennedy assassination. So I went to the FBI at the time and also offered my services because I was beginning to suspect that I thought Oswald had been silenced, they weren't interested. I think they were already pretty set on the lone assassin theory, though I don't know. I shouldn't say that. That was just a private opinion. And there was also an article about me in the local New Orleans paper that I had written this book on Oswald, based on Oswald, The Idle Warriors, a novel which I sent to 2 publishers and it was rejected, so I didn't pursue the matter any longer, but I was rewriting it when the Kennedy assassination took place. Now, you had picked Oswald for a subject of a book prior to his involvement in the assassination. Yeah, on the basis of his defection to the Soviet Union, which was really a big deal for us, Here I had known somebody who had defected to the Soviet Union, and wow, and that was really big International Orient Express type stuff. And at that time, I thought, well, that's a great subject for a book. I'll explain why this happened, and as I felt I could, and I think I have missed the boat a little looking back on it now. I have. But in many respects, I think, a lot of the reasons I gave in that book for Johnny Shelburne, my hero, ending up going to Russia were valid for Oswald as well, as if he were really not a government agent and as if he really did go there because he was disillusioned with the United States. Now, you say if he really was not a government agent, is there any doubt in your mind as to whether or not he was or wasn't? Well, not only in my mind, not based on any concrete evidence that I have, because, once again, I haven't been pursuing it, but that seems to be a very widespread opinion of many critics of the commission, including Garrison. I understand is that he was some kind of CIA agent, or now the latest Garrison's latest that he was an FBI informer. I find this hard to believe that he was a CIA agent, because if he was just such a good one, because he didn't come across like a guy who was capable. Well, even, the idea of him being capable of going to the Soviet Union was kind of surprising to me. He just didn't come across as a very efficient sort of person, and you always think of spies as, of course, I'm sure they pick people who they don't look like spies when they pick spies, so it's a double bind sort of thing. I really can't say, It's so fucking hilarious. Kerry, we're going to have to break it up for a time. I want to thank you for being our guest and being able to explain all those particular points that you took issue with Weisberg. And we'll probably be hearing something about you from New Orleans, right? I hope it's all good. All right. The question of the correct designation of Lieutenant John Donovan was cleared in the following evening. According to Donovan's testimony, he was the, quote, officer in command, not the commanding officer. Gotcha. So, Lieutenant John Donovan. Let's see what we can't pull on Mr. Donovan. We have one last page here. And this appears to be just a duplicate of a previous page. Let me see. All right, so that is going to do it for this particular interview of Kerry Thornley. which took place on February 5th, 1968 on WLCY Radio on the Open Mic Show with Bob Rourke out of St. Petersburg, Florida. So this has been part 3 of our Weisberg's Kerry Thornley archive. And there's been some really good nuggets in here, right? Kerry Thornley basically dropping a dime on when the Secret Service actually came and talked to him Saturday, and then it was Saturday around midnight, so after midnight Saturday. So then we can pretty much put him back in New Orleans at that time, because basically what he had to have, after the incident at the Texas Theater, when he shows up in Igor Vagonov's car and disappears from Mac Pate's garage, that's around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That's the last time that we see Kerry Thornley. There's plenty of time for him to make it from Dallas to New Orleans in order to be questioned at midnight by the Secret Service. So I think we can lock that timeline into place. But that's going to do it for this episode. We will be back with part 4 of the Kerry Thornley archive of Harold Weisberg on Monday. And so I hope you're enjoying this stuff. I certainly am. We've got a solid, 80 files to go. And so we're going to be on Kerry Thornley for the next couple weeks. So I appreciate your tuning in, and I will see you guys next time. Oh, one more thing. If you haven't bought my fucking book yet, please go over to Amazon. And it's A Warning from History by Corey Hughes. Can't miss it. It's got 5 stars. So please go pick up the book if you're interested in picking up my notes or a limited edition poster or any of that stuff. Go to buymeacoffee.com/JFKbook, and you can do all that stuff there. Or if you want to make a donation or a recurring donation, you're more than welcome to do that as well. So thank you for tuning in, and I will see you guys on Monday.